Good afternoon. Welcome to the Mountain Lion Foundation's educational webinar series. Today, we are joined by author and researcher Leslie Patton. Leslie is a naturalist and a writer. Living for over 15 years in Northwest Wyoming, she loves exploring, hiking, and camera trapping wildlife. In her book, Ghost Walker, Tracking a Mountain Lion's Soul Through Science and Story, she interviewed over 50 wildlife biologists, trackers, conservationists, and houndsmen to reveal the hidden world of mountain lions. Her most recent book, Shadow Landscape, is a compilation of wildlife stories. Continuing her research into mountain lions, Shadow Landscape contains an essay entitled Bighorns Gordian Knot that investigates the tangle and politically fraught issue of bighorn sheep and mountain lions. We welcome you, Leslie. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn it over to Leslie. And Leslie, you can share your presentation whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Actually, you gave a pretty good introduction. I was going to relate a little bit of more of that myself. So I moved to Northwest Wyoming in about 2008 and got very interested in tracking and trail camera work with mountain lions. Although there wasn't much information out there on mountain lions at the time, except for how to stay safe in mountain lion country, and also mainly a lot of scholarly compilations. So I just started interviewing people who would be able to have an up close and personal with mountain lions, which is pretty rare. So that would be like biologists, conservationists, trackers, houndsmen. And out of that came my book, Ghost Walker. At the time, I knew what was happening on a cursory level with mountain lions and bighorn sheep, particularly in the Southwest. And I knew it was a pretty involved and knotty problem. And I didn't get into totally researching it at that time. And so I didn't put it into Ghost Walker. But last year during a COVID year, I spent some time researching, doing basically a deep dive into what's going on with bighorn sheep and mostly what's going on in the Southwest United States with culling mountain lions, basically clearing mountain ranges of mountain lions, then putting bighorn sheep on them and keeping those ranges clear of mountain lions to enable those sheep to get a leg up. So I'm going to do something a little different here, where I'm going to kind of start at the end with my, I guess you could say, conclusions, and then work backward to how I got there. But before I begin with that, you first have to understand what's going on with bighorn sheep, which is quite complex. So bighorn sheep, as well as, well, there used to be about 1 to 2 million, nobody knows exactly, bighorn sheep throughout the Western United States, Canada, and Mexico. And market hunting, which is basically when people came in, occupied in the 1860s, occupied the Western states, and they started hunting for food because there was no regulation, or they were hunting for hides and then selling those hides, or maybe they were feeding the railroad workers or miners. So they decimated not just bighorn sheep, but also our pronghorn and elk and deer. And one of the other things that happened during that time is, as they cleared off the bison and Native Americans were put on reservations, they brought in hundreds of thousands, even millions of livestock throughout the Western states. And that livestock not only decimated the landscape, but also in particular, domestic sheep brought in diseases to bighorn sheep. So these domestic sheep, of course, have had these diseases in Europe for thousands of years, and our bighorn sheep were not accustomed to that. So you could sort of think of what happened to Native Americans when Europeans came in with their diseases that Native Americans had no immunities to. So that was basically the same case with bighorn sheep. So then during the early 1900s, there was regulations started happening. People saw that basically our ungulates were disappearing, and they started having hunting regulations. And during that period in the 1900s through the 1960s, most of our ungulates thrive because we had regulated hunting. And then they did move some animals around like elk and pronghorn. And they did a little bit of moving of bighorn sheep. So other ungulates were thriving, but bighorn sheep were not. And then by the 1960s, there was only 25,000 bighorn sheep left. And so conservation bighorn sheep groups, hunters were alarmed. We were losing our bighorn sheep. And this is basically due to diseases. So what they started doing, which was a well-intentioned effort, was, and mainly if you're talking about Rocky Mountain bighorns, they were moving them from Canada and Wyoming into unoccupied territories that used to be occupied by bighorns, and then desert bighorns from the Southwest where there was still some remaining. But because these bighorns had been exposed to disease, it was like moving a snotty-nosed kid into a healthy daycare, and then all the kids in that daycare were snotty-nosed as well. So that they were basically spreading all these diseases around unknowingly. So I'm going to do a little reading from my essay that's in my new book, and to describe kind of what happened. We were clueless, Mike Cox of Nevada Department of Wildlife told me. We didn't want to be clueless, but we didn't have the science behind it. We didn't have any money, nobody cared. There's no huge grants working on bighorns. We were blind to what was causing the issue, just a lot of ideas and theories. It was a big circle jerk for decades. Then in 2009, more than 2,000 bighorn died throughout the Western states. No one understood what was going on, Cox told me. Finally, a breakthrough occurred in the lab. Thomas Besser, a clinical veterinarian pathologist from Washington State University, along with a few others, were able to isolate and identify the ringleader of bighorn bacteria, Mycoplasma ovipneumonia. And from now on, I'm just going to call it MOVI for short. Although there are several other bacteria living dormant in bighorns, with their defense mechanisms intact, they can fight those off, but MOVI destroys those immunities. Think of MOVI as what HIV is to AIDS. It weakens the immune system, leaving it vulnerable to a host of other diseases that might not otherwise kill a bighorn. The fine hairs in the respiratory tract called ciliary are damaged. The bighorns are coughing, their lungs slowly destroyed. Some develop nasal tumors, which make it harder to slough the disease off, becoming super spreaders. So we kind of all know these terms now because of COVID. Of course, COVID is a virus and MOVI is a bacterial infection, but we have some of the same terms like asymptomatic spreaders, super spreaders, and MOVI, as I said, it wasn't even kind of identified. They knew that bighorns had respiratory problems, but they also had other diseases, but they didn't really know exactly what was going on. And once they found that MOVI was the ringleader, they could now begin to test for it before they started doing these transplants. But not all the states were doing testing at the same time. So some states like California and Nevada were kind of more on top of it, and some of the other Southwest states like Arizona were a little slower to test for MOVI before they did the reintroductions. But then what they started to discover as they dove into this, and we know this with COVID now, is that there's variants. So some variants are more deadly than others, like now we have the Delta. Well, same with MOVI. There's some variants that are more deadly than others. So now that when they do a transplant, not only do they have to test for MOVI, but they also have to test for these variants, and it can get quite complicated. So let's say they have a small herd on a mountain in Arizona, and this has happened, where they want to infuse some new genetics. And so then they have to test both the herds to see what the variants are, and they have to match them. And if the variants don't match, then they can't do the introduction. So what happens with these herds is that basically Movi can be just lie dormant in these herds for decades and decades. And then a stressor comes up, and then just a natural stressor. So a natural stressor can be something like a difficult winter or a drought. That would be a normal stressor on a herd. But when that happens, then that can reduce their immunity, and all of a sudden, here comes Mycoplasma over pneumonia, and you can get what they call an all-age die-off, where you have a large die-off in the herd. And the other thing that can happen is you can just have it kind of dormant in the herd, but you have a ewe that is nursing a lamb, and lambs don't have as much immunity, so it passes it on through nursing to the lamb, and then you can have what they call no lamb recruitment or little lamb recruitment, and then you just have a herd that's aging out slowly. So Movi can be in this population for many decades. Let's say they have an all-age die-off. It may take 20 years easily for that herd to just rebound naturally from that. So one of the other things about Movi is that and bighorn sheep. So bighorn sheep, naturally, particularly rams, will do what they call walkabouts. And this is basically programmed in them for genetics, to pass on their genetics. And so these rams can do walkabouts 20, 40, I've heard of ones doing 80 to 100 miles. Sometimes they just do them in a big circle and come back to their original herd. And maybe they don't even have Movi in their system, but they might encounter a native, a goat or a sheep, a domestic sheep, and then they don't even really have to touch noses. It can be kind of close by, and the wind can be right, and all of a sudden they've contracted the disease, and then they're spreading around. So now I'm going to kind of go to my sort of, I guess you could say, my conclusions, which always could be changing, and then we'll backtrack from there. So my first example of what I think is a large protected habitat for bighorns that has no livestock in it and no predator controls would be the Desert National Wildlife Refuge. So the Desert National Wildlife Refuge, and you can see here it is over here, it was created in 1936. And basically at that time, it had about 1,000 to 1,200 bighorns in there. And that was considered to be about the historic numbers. And also the habitat was, they considered that to be intact, just historically intact. And so they created this refuge. And then in 1940, the Nevada Test and Training Range was created around the Desert National Wildlife Refuge. At that time, it had a different name, and then it changed. So the refuge, even at this time, there is a small hunt. It's a 2-week hunt. You're not allowed to have llamas or pack goats in there. There's no livestock. And it's pretty rugged in there. You can visit, but it's rough. So historically in 1988, there were about 1,000 bighorns, the historic numbers. But then all of a sudden in 1992, there was a sudden decline from 1,000 to 200. So just an incredible drop all of a sudden. And at that time, remember, they didn't know anything about Movi, and they had no idea really what caused it. So the first two things they thought of was predators. Was it mountain lions, of course, or was it disease? Well, they didn't really know what it was, but at that time there was an outcry from sportsmen. And so what the government did in response, they didn't create a hunt on cougars, so they didn't do anything with mountain lions, but instead they introduced 35 bighorns into the area. And those 35 bighorns came from a completely different mountain range. And the idea was, we're going to introduce those 35 bighorns, and they're going to kind of help boost that small population up. But that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was almost all of them, all these 35, they died from mountain lion predation. And the reason is they were taken from an area that was devoid of mule deer. So these 35 bighorns were completely naive to predators. So nothing happened. They just kind of left it alone. There was no mountain lion predation management plan or anything. And then now, after what it's been probably 25 years, the herd is almost again at historic numbers, which is 900. And they know now, looking back, that die-off, that sudden die-off, was from Mycoplasma over pneumonia, or MOVI. And that herd, that bighorn herd, they recovered in the general time that they would probably normally recover from an outbreak. So my second example of a large area that is a protected area for bighorn sheep would be the San Andreas National Wildlife Refuge. So again, in New Mexico, because of market hunting, because of degradation from livestock, and just disease, all the bighorns were and other wildlife were kind of decimated. So in 1941, the refuge was created. There was just, if you look over here, there's only 33 bighorns left in the San Andreas mountain range. And this is the mountain range here. And here is the refuge over here. And the San Andreas is considered one of probably the best habitat in all of New Mexico. It probably held the biggest metapopulation of bighorn sheep. So just to we'll talk about metapopulation again, but just to explain that. So bighorns basically live in smaller herds, and but they need, a larger, to have good genetics, they need to have a larger area with diversity of habitat and herds there that they can travel through. So a large metapopulation would be made up of subpopulations. So getting back to the San Andreas, in 1941, they designed this refuge, and it was specifically to protect bighorns. And then in 1945, after the war, the White Sands Missile Range was created, and you can see it here, and it encompasses the San Andreas. And there's no human presence there because it's within the missile range. So during that time, there was no livestock and no hunting, and the bighorn sheep thrived, and they got up to about 270 and at some point 200, and that's probably about what the range can support. Those are actually kind of small. It's a small area. But then all of a sudden there was a crash. Again, a sudden crash down to one ewe, the remaining ewe in 1997. And of course, that was like an outcry, like what's happening here? Nobody knew. And so actually bighorns were then given emergency ESA protection in New Mexico. So the New Mexico Game and Fish, what they did, because that crash, what they thought that crash was from scabies. So they could see there was scabies in this population. And scabies isn't usually something that kills an entire herd of 200 bighorns. It can mess up several of them, and it can be difficult, but they usually with natural immunity can overcome that. So, but they didn't know where this scabies was coming from and what was going on with it. So what they did was they took 6 rams, and they called them sentinel rams, and they put them on different mountain ranges. So they put each ram on a different mountain range, and they left them there for 2 years, and they just checked out, where are they going to die? Maybe this is from the soil, or we don't know. Well, the rams survived, and in fact, that one ewe was impregnated by one of those rams. And then the herd began to rebound because they started doing some reintroductions. So they did several reintroductions, what they call translocations of bighorn into that herd. For the first 10 years, they did do mountain lion culling until 2010. But then after that, since 2010, there has been no mountain lion culling at all in the San Andreas. And you can see it's rebounded, and it's considered one of the best herds in New Mexico. And there is a small hunt there. It's 8-day hunt in December for bighorns. You have to get clearance from the military to go in there. It's very kind of difficult, and you have to be escorted in. So just to go a little bit more about New Mexico, on the bottom here, you can see this is a contract. New Mexico is pretty into clearing mountain ranges of mountain lions, what they call pre-treating, and then they'll put bighorn sheep on a mountain, and then they'll hire these lion contractors, and you can see the agreement down there at the bottom, paying snaremen and houndsmen per day and per lion that's removed. So it's pretty intensive there. But I'm going to talk about, here's a San Andreas where they have no mountain lion culling at all. You can see that's a very healthy herd there of bighorn sheep. And again, just to genetically on these small ranges, they feel like maybe 150 to 200 bighorn sheep is kind of a minimum to have good genetics. So you can see these three that are the best herds. This one, the Frog Christables, actually, if I go back for a minute, the Frog Christables are over here. And this area to the west of the White Sands Missile Range, which is again protected, is owned by Ted Turner. So that has no livestock, doesn't have basically people, coming on and visiting. So that's also makes this protected area even larger. And the Frog Christables are on Ted Turner's ranch. And they're such a healthy herd that they even use some of that herd for translocations. There is an agreement with the Turner Ranch with mountain lion culling, but the agreement is only for mountain lions that have specialized in killing bighorn sheep. And that is very rare event. So basically, mountain lions are opportunistic. Their basic prey is deer. If there's some bighorn sheep that happen to encounter amongst a herd of deer, that they may kill that opportunistically. But a mountain lion who specializes in bighorn sheep is rare. And in fact, in the San Andreas Mountains, there was a 10-year mountain lion study. And at the same time, they were collared. This is during the time the San Andreas was building up its bighorn herd. And so the mountain lion biologists said, well, we'll look at predation as well. And during that 10 years, there was only one mountain lion that specialized in bighorn sheep. And they moved that mountain lion, and that took care of that event. The caballos, as you can see, is another really successful herd there of bighorn sheep. And interestingly enough, that wasn't even on the radar of New Mexico Game and Fish. These are kind of their radar where they do a lot of killing of mountain lions. This is the caballos are about 50 miles south of the Turner Ranch of the Frog Christables, and they were occupied by Walkabouts, and you can see it's a really successful herd there. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute, and we're going to watch some desert bighorn sheep. Okay, so like I said, a lot of this culling of mountain lions to put bighorn sheep on mountains is going on in the Southwest. And to understand that, you kind of have to understand the geography and the history of the Southwest. So I've got two maps up here. One of them is Nevada, the other is Arizona and New Mexico. And in Arizona, these areas are called Sky Islands. And in Nevada, this is a basin range. It's essentially kind of the same, where you have mountain ranges that are kind of small, isolated habitat with basin or desert in between. And historically, indigenous peoples were doing burning in these areas fairly frequently. And the main ungulates that were in these areas were bighorn sheep and pronghorn. And as the Spanish came in, they brought in their livestock and changed the topography of the area. So it turned out, instead of having more of a grasslands, you had more of a desert shrublands. And that brought in deer and who falls deer, but mountain lions. So it may have been that these desert areas really didn't have very many mountain lions initially. And you might have thought of, when we're talking again about metapopulations. So Nevada, actually, this is Highway 80 here, and south of Highway 80. So just according to this map, these are unoccupied ranges. The blue are desert bighorn, and north of Highway 80 are basically Rocky Mountain bighorns. But this Nevada was all considered to be one large metapopulation, and have the biggest number of population of bighorn sheep probably in the Western United States. And if you look at a place like Arizona with these Sky Islands here, so maybe most of these Sky Islands, maybe they can only support, one range could support, let's say 200, 250, 300 bighorns. And then you might have some event, maybe they used up their habitat, maybe there was a drought, and then you'd have some of that herd die off, and then you'd have walkabouts going across these grasslands and going to different mountain ranges and then inhabiting them. So what you might have seen like 500 or 600 years ago, if you looked at this, if you thought of each one of these mountain ranges as like a light, you might have seen lights blinking on and off as they winked out and then moved to another mountain range. Well, in the Spanish, like I said, brought in their livestock. And of course, we came in and built roads and houses. And so all the metapopulation now has been decimated, and because it's hard for a sheep to do a walkabout across a road, or if they do these walkabouts, they might get diseases from domestic animals. So we've cut off a lot of this genetic exchange. So what happens in places like Arizona or New Mexico is you have these isolated groups, which you wouldn't have had in the past, but you have these smaller groups instead of a metapopulation. And then the game and fish for that state will dump maybe 30 bighorn sheep in by helicopter, so you can they can have genetic diversity in there. So I'm going to kind of give a story about the COFA, which is a National Wildlife Refuge, and just kind of a lesson story. And the COFA is right over here, and it's on the border of California in Arizona. And it's a very important refuge for bighorn sheep and for Arizona. So there's traditionally about 900 bighorn sheep there. It's a desert environment. And it's used for translocations for Arizona, and even New Mexico has used it as well for desert bighorns. So in the early 2000s, that herd went from 900 almost overnight, or 800 to 400 animals. And of course, they didn't know about Moby at the time. It was the early 2000s. And they didn't know what was happening, but everybody was alarmed because this is their main repository of bighorn sheep for translocations. And simultaneously, Arizona was doing lots of what they call managed waters. So in 1997, there are about 750 managed waters. These are waters that are kind of artificial water areas. We'll talk more about them. They supply them for bighorn sheep, but other animals as well. But by 2000, they went from 750 to 3,000. So now Arizona has over 3,000 managed waters. Anyway, at that time in the early 2000s, when this crash happened with bighorn sheep, they had trail cameras at these managed waters in the COFA. And they started seeing lions coming to these managed waters. And they hadn't really had any lions. They maybe occasionally had a lion pass through the desert. But in general, there weren't any lions in this area in the COFA. And they really hadn't had really hunting even in this area. So at one point they saw 14 lions come in at these water catchments, which was obviously alarming. And they immediately thought, well, that's what the crash is from. It's got to be from all these lions. So what the Arizona Game and Fish did is they set up this whole region here as a predator management area. And although it looks small here, it's quite big because these are major interstates here. So it's quite huge. And here's the boundary of California. And their predator management plan involved if lions, they collared every lion that they could find. They said that the lion predator management plan would end when there was 800 bighorns. And if a lion killed 2 bighorn sheep within 6 months, then they'd dispatch that lion. And also they made this, you can see here's a COFA, but it's really big. They made it quite big because they said, well, there's going to be lions coming in that are dispersers. And so we can't have that either. So now we need to talk about the world of mountain lions and what a disperser is. And I'm going to go through kind of a history of mountain lions from birth until they disperse, just to give you a little more information. Okay, so mountain lions form their dens. They don't really dig a den. They basically look for a very safe area, which would be in dense vegetation or spaces among boulders or an intense log jam, someplace where it's hard for a predator to get to. They have typical litters are about 2 to 4 kittens. And the kittens are born with their ears and eyes closed. And you can see there, they're barely able to move. And they weigh little more than a pound. And within 2 weeks, their ears and eyes open. And you've probably seen pictures of their eyes being sky blue then. And they begin to explore those makeshift dens. Then at about 4 weeks, the kittens are engaging in mock play and battles, and they're venturing out to explore their surroundings. And by 2 to 3 months, 8 to 12 weeks, kittens are weaned and they're on the move, and they leave the safety of their nursery. And though they're real capable of negotiating rugged terrain, and they'll accompany their mom on her hunting rounds, but they can't climb trees yet. So these kittens are probably about 4 to 5 months old. Probably about 5 to 6 months old, they'll be able to climb trees. And although they look big, these kittens are highly dependent on their mother's hunting skills throughout the first year. And if a kitten loses her mother when she's less than a year old, she almost has no chance of survival. So she really doesn't, it takes a while for them to really have confidence in their hunting skills. So between 6 and 18 months is a very important time for the cubs because they're learning the art of hunting and killing prey, and they're exploring their natal range, and they're learning how to deal with potential enemies. And I don't know if it's still up there. There used to be a really good video on Cat Watch online. It was taken by Dr. Mark Elbrock in the Jackson study. And he had a video of a mother and 2 kittens that were a year old. And this mother brought a wounded fawn, which is not untypical, to her kittens. And these 1-year-old kittens had no idea what to do with it. So they didn't know how to kill it. It took them about 5 minutes to figure out how to give the kind of killing blow to them. So just to give you an idea of Cougar Society, their social network, and this all was basically kind of uncovered by Dr. Mark Elbrock in the 16-year Jackson study. So it was before that, it was thought that basically cats, cougars were not social animals. Basically, they only came together for mating. But he found they had a very tight social network. So this is basically kind of his diagram. And what he did was, if you think of each one of these, he called them communities. So each one of these little circles with a C would be a dominant male. So this is the dominant male's territory. And here's another one. And here would be another one. And depending on the terrain, these territories can be as much as 200 square miles. So they can be quite big. And he called the whole system a network. And these males would know their neighboring male, and they just kind of like, you know, your neighbor, just kind of keep the peace there. They just and they mark their territory with something called a scrape. And we're going to see a video of that in a minute. I'll tell you more about scrapes. But so there might be like, be one dominant male and maybe there'd be 2 to 4 females in these areas. So when a kitten is going to disperse, they're about 14 to 24 months. These kittens disperse. So a female is going to want to go close to her mother. So she might just disperse over here. She can't be in the same area as her father, but pretty close by if there's room. But a male, he has to find his own territory. So he's got to get out of this whole network and find a territory that's empty, that has several females in it, or a female in it at least. And it's pretty dangerous for the male because he's got to cross roads, he's got to deal with hunters, he's also got to feed himself on the way. And these young cougars are not very adept yet, as we said, at killing, and it's dangerous to kill something large like a deer. So it's usually these young dispersers that when you hear about the goat or the chicken or the cat, the house cat that got killed, it's usually these young dispersers. And once they find a territory that is vacant, then they'll prey switch and mainly kill deer. Okay, so I'm going to show you a series of videos taken at one scrape tree. These are from my trail camera. And you're going to see in the first video, you're going to see a male making a scrape, and then you're going to see a lot of other animals coming there. So as we said about those communities, the way that these male lions mark their territory is basically with these scrapes, and they sometimes urinate or defecate on the scrape. And they'll usually make them at corridors. So they're travel corridors. So one of the reasons is obviously to mark their territory. Second reason would be to find females that are in estrus, because females can go into estrus at any time of the year. And if these territories are quite large, that's one way to find them. And also just to tell other dispersers that, this is my territory, move on. And probably things we don't know because we can't smell very well. So here you go. That's a female. These are all at the same tree. So I thought I'd share this one video. This was a cougar that I'd seen around, and a male. And this video I'm going to show you, the last time I saw him, he had obviously been in a fight and he lost one of his eyes. And then he still would be able to hunt with just one eye. And you'll see this video, he doesn't have eye shine in one of his eyes, the eye that's damaged. And then after that, the only cat I was seeing around probably was the one that won the fight, so a younger male. Okay, this slide needs a little explaining. So this is the eastern side of the Sierra Nevadas in California. And these are not desert bighorns, they're Sierra bighorns, which are actually a unique subspecies. And all these blues you see belong to a herd of bighorns. There's only 100 there. It looks like there's 1 million, but those are all GPS points over time. So it's a herd of 100 bighorn. And down here, what you don't see are about 2,000 mule deer down here. And this area down here was already occupied by mountain lions. So they all had their own territory on these mule deer. And in comes a disperser, and he has nowhere to go. And these red things, probably over a long period of time, are kills of bighorn sheep. So that was a case of a lion that really did specialize, because he had no territories down in this area. So I'm going to let you read the right-hand side, and then I'll tell you the story about the skull on the left. That skull was from a young mountain lion that I encountered in the winter that was dead, and he was basically intact. And when I looked around the area, I could see that there'd been a lion kill, a deer kill in the area. And so I have a permit, and I brought the skull to the museum, and then we cleaned it up. And you can see that there's puncture wounds there, and those puncture wounds are from another lion. So this was a young disperser who probably smelled some dead prey, and he went over, and there was the resident male, and he got in a fight and he got killed. So you can see these young male dispersers have a tough time. So we're going to just watch a bighorn sheep video at a natural water catchment for a moment. Okay, so we're going to come back to the COFA and the story of the COFA. So first of all, you got to remember the story about our natural, our water catchments that are not natural, the water catchments that are managed water catchments. You can see the one down on the lower right, and that is an Arizona water catchment, very open. And some of these water catchments, for bighorn sheep, they can be way high up because bighorn sheep live, top mountains. So some of the water they might have to deliver by helicopter. Anyway, you can think about bighorn sheep and water in the Southwest. So the Southwest, of course, all of the West is a dry environment and really dependent on water. But the Southwest, in particular, the desert, these water is precious. And bighorn sheep, for thousands of years, they had probably kind of programmed into them where these natural Tanahas were. And so they knew where to go. And in general, but over time, with the last probably 100, 150 years, with white men coming in, we kind of use the water for ourselves, for irrigation, for just drinking water, and a lot of those Tanahas have dried up. So these natural, these water catchments, that are provided by the Arizona Game and Fish, they're good for bighorn sheep. But Ron Thompson did a really interesting study and put trail cameras for several years at all three of the deserts in the Southwest at these water catchments. And what he found was that bighorn sheep were only using these water catchments during 4 to 5 months of the year, basically in the summer months. And the rest of the time, they can get their water from plant material. They can kick over a barrel cactus and eat what's inside and get their water that way. But predators need water year round. So what he saw was that there were mountain lions and other predators coming year round to these new water catchments. So he devised a water catchment. You can see it there on the left-hand side of the screen, where he basically made those bars just big enough for the nose of a deer or a bighorn sheep, and their tongue could go in, and so they could drink. But a round face predator like a mountain lion can't get in there. So that was kind of an interesting solution. So going back to the COFA and their predator management plan, eventually in 2020, they got up to, well, they said they'd cut it off at 800. They got up to 900 bighorn sheep, and they did cut off their predator management plan. But if you think about it, that's basically about the time period that they would have recovered from Movi. And they know now, when they look back and they've done the testing, that what did kill those bighorn sheep, they weren't those predators that were at the water catchment, but basically it was Mycoplasma ovipneumonia. And then the herd recovered in about the regular time period they might otherwise. So I'm going to just switch over to another part of Arizona and another interesting lesson, which is this is Tucson, and in the background you see a picture of the Catalinas. So the Catalinas were kind of one of the last places where the Arizona Game and Fish really wanted to restore bighorn sheep. The last of there were bighorn sheep there historically, but they died out probably from Mycoplasma ovipneumonia in 1996. And so the area, which is really an incredible ecosystem, goes from desert all the way up to alpine, and has about 67 mountain lions they counted there, plus javelinas and deer, and but it didn't have bighorn sheep anymore. But Arizona had been relocating bighorns in ranges across, desert bighorns in ranges across Arizona that were pretty remote. And so they could just, pretty much do what they wanted, clear mountains of mountain lions and put the sheep on and kind of do their thing. But they knew they couldn't do that in the Catalinas, because the Catalinas are right next to Tucson. Tucson is a very aware and aggressive, progressive city. And also there's a lot of recreating that goes on the Catalinas. So they had to come up with a different idea. And to their credit, what they came up with, and this is about 2012, was they're going to put together a working group of interested parties. So the working group would consist of, hunters, Arizona game fish, groups that were interested in bighorn sheep, and also just conservation groups that were in the area. So they put together this working group and they said, okay, you guys, you figure it out how we're going to do this relocation, this restoration, and we'll abide by what you say. Well, the working group, of course, had a lot to hash out, but the biggest contentious issue were mountain lions, what we're going to do. So in general, what happens with relocations is though, as we know in the COFA, what they did was they put collars on every single mountain lion they could find for the whole course of their predator management plan. In general, what they do with relocations is they'll put a collar on a third of the bighorns that they relocate. And the relocations are usually done in 3 to 4 batches. So they'll do a batch of like 35 bighorns and they'll collar a third of them. Well, what the working group decided to do was they wouldn't collar any mountain lions at all. And they wanted to collar every bighorn sheep that was put in. And the agreement was that they had, if they got a mortality signal on a bighorn sheep, they'd go in, they'd see how that bighorn died, because it's not necessarily by predation. And if it died from predation, like a mountain lion, then they'd send in a houndsman, and the houndsman had 5 days in which to dispatch that mountain lion, and it had to be the mountain lion. It couldn't be any mountain lion. He had to basically find that mountain lion on that kill. And after the 5 days, kind of that was it. So the first relocation batch was brought in November 2013, and that was a drop of 31 bighorns, and they were all collared. And by March, 16 were dead, and 14 of those were by lions. So what was happening here? Basically, these bighorns, there weren't any bighorns on the mountain at all. You have to remember, since 1996. And the main area that's safe for bighorns is a rocky ridge called Push Ridge. Well, these bighorns came in and they had no idea where they were going. They were dropped in by helicopter, and they dropped them as close as they could to Push Ridge. But these, instead of going up to Push Ridge, what the bighorns did is they went up the mountain and they wound up in the forested area, in the alpine area. And so they were killed, a lot of them were killed by mountain lions. So there was a big outcry, as you can imagine. And people were like, oh, we gotta kill the mountain lions. We gotta do what we used to do here. But to the credit of Arizona Game and Fish, they said, we're gonna abide by what the working groups has told us. And in that spring, because they could see, because they're all collared, there were 5 lambs that were born on Push Ridge. So the remaining bighorns did find the safe area and went up there. And then there were 2 more releases, and that was through 2016. And one of the things that they did find was that a few of the releases, some of the bighorns that they released were from areas like, I think, the superstitions, where there aren't any mountain lions, and those were very naive to predators. So that probably is not a good idea. But over the 4 years of the relocation project, only 8 lions were taken out of that in the agreement. And as of now, which would be like last year, 2020, they're on target. They don't judge for 10 years how their relocation went. And as of now, they're really on target to have, I can't remember what it is, 100 or 120 bighorns. Their lamb recruitment is 50%, and typically it's about half that. And so they're on target for success, and they haven't removed any lions at all. They basically dropped that predation management plan. So we're gonna watch another video of some bighorns. So I'm going to leave this up and I'm going to do a final reading from my from my book, from my essay. There's a point sometime in the future where we'll have to cut bighorns loose. Yet we do have an obligation to the bighorns to do our best for them, to right so many of the wrongs they've suffered from our misdeeds. In my mind, perhaps our best is displayed in places like the Desert National Wildlife Refuge or San Andreas National Wildlife Refuge. Immense tracts of mountain ranges surrounded by even larger tracts of wild areas completely off limits to the public and livestock. Allow the bighorn populations to fluctuate naturally. Instead of trying to fill every historically occupied mountain with bighorn sheep, we should consider a subpopulation model where suitable habitat can provide the bighorns with natural connective corridors to other nearby ranges. Land might need to be purchased to enlarge a protected area and grazing allotments retired. Initial habitat restoration would be completed. Then we just let bighorns be bighorns and lions be lions. And I want to end with like one video of a lion.
All right, I think we're going to move into the question and answer portion of our webinar today. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, but you all can go ahead and raise your hand for those questions.
Okay, first question is Louise. Please ask your question.
Oh, I've got several. I guess as first speaker, I don't know who else is watching this, but thank you genuinely for the great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so a couple questions. I guess ask them all at once real quick. So what type of tree? That tree was famous. What kind of species of tree? Everybody was going to town on that tree. And secondly, if I missed it, excuse me, but why bighorn? Is it just to satisfy the hunters? And the last one is, my family and I, we've been using the deer whistles or animal alerts on the front bumpers, and it saved us about 8 times in the wildlife. Are you promoting the deer whistles you put on the front bumpers? It puts out a high pitched whistle when you're going over 35, and the deer and bear and everybody run away from the vehicle. Okay, thank you.
So that since I live in Wyoming, there's a lot of snow in the winter, and so cougars like to put scrapes under large trees. That was a Doug fir because there's not as much snow under there in the winter, or very little. So kind of cougars are basically visual animals. So they really need that scrape to kind of identify, and they do mark it too, but for this, the visual cue is important. And I forgot, what was your second question?
So it was a Douglas fir though, huh?
Yeah, that was a Douglas fir, which just in my area, those are big trees. So that's a good tree it just happens to be where I live.
So it's not a particular favorite because all the wildlife were just loving on that tree.
Yeah, that's a particular corridor too. That's right, there. So there's a tree and then there's a corridor. And yeah, if you're into trail camera work, basically look for mountain lion scrapes and then put a trail camera there and you'll get lots of wildlife.
Right. And the second one was, and I missed, why are they introducing bighorn?
Well, they're not, they're relocating them, I guess you could say. They're not, bighorns used to inhabit the whole Western United States. So.
Oh, they're indigenous?
Yeah, they are. It's just what we're why, why we're having problems with bighorns basically compared to deer or elk or pronghorn, which are, have rebounded, is because of Mycoplasma ovopneumonia. They just are, there's a saying that sheep are born ready to die. So they just, and they just really don't have any immunity to these basically domestic sheep, European diseases, which domestic sheep do, but also goats can transmit it. Mountain goats carry it. But domestic sheep, and that would include sheep on public lands that are, on public allotments, as well as hobbyists who have sheep and goats. If they come into contact with a bighorn, they can easily transmit that disease.
Huh. And then the deer whistles, deer alerts. Are you promoting those? I wish the car manufacturers would build them into the front bumpers.
Yeah, I mean, I basically think just be careful when you drive. I've never hit a deer or anything like that, but I don't know much about them. I don't use them, and there's a lot of wildlife where I am, and I just try to stay very alert. But I believe what you say, that they're really effective.
Okay, thank you.
Next question is from Pamela. Pamela, please ask your question.
Hi, I'm assuming that the scrape tree. Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm assuming the scrape tree is in Wyoming where you live?
It is, yeah.
Okay, and then in the discussions about the snaring, do they typically attempt to catch by paw or by neck?
I think basically it's by paw. So these guys are really schooled of like exactly, where these lions will step. So they basically step right into that snare. And then I think some of these snares, I don't know if this is what a houndsman or snare, guys would use that are paid, but now they can have you can have an alert. So you get a buzz, but they may just check they probably put tons of snares out. Snares are really cheap and you can just, put them out very easily as long as you check them. But if they're going to kill that animal anyway, and they're paid to be, to kill it, they may, just check them, whatever, every 5 days or whatever.
Well, I'm pretty disappointed to hear that because I know a lot of non-targeted wildlife end up in those things too. But anyway, and then you mentioned about possibly retiring grazing leases that, for the benefit of bighorns. And I wondered if you're aware of any particular ones or how I would identify those as desirable for that reason.
Where do you live, Pamela?
I spent a lot of time in Idaho.
Okay. Well, certainly Idaho has a lot of domestic sheep, a lot, and they're really into their sheep, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So what basically a lot of these bighorn conservation groups have been doing, they've been paying to retire allotments. So they've been the ones who've kind of been putting forth, and of course these are hunting groups, but they care about bighorns, and they've been paying for it. And there are ways to kind of find out about it through especially the allotments. Like I know there was one in the Wyoming range in Wyoming, and the state legislature in Wyoming is of course very pro ranching. And I think it had been kind of, I don't know if we'd call it retired, but they'd taken domestic sheep off, but now the Forest Service there's kind of a big battle because the Forest Service was like, well, we want to put the domestic sheep back on there, and it's pretty close to a bighorn area. So there was a lot of public comments about it. I don't know how it's going to come out, but kind of my feeling about it is that, hey, bighorn sheep are they're in the public trust, And we should all be interested in what happens with bighorn sheep as well. And of course, that affects mountain lions too. And, you know, if more of us could be pushing for these retirements, or possibly I've thought about, and I've never heard anybody say this, but you know, what are these sheep providing us with? Well, mostly wool, but also, you know, lamb to eat. So if there was some kind of certificate, it's not like all the sheep, domestic sheep, are in areas that have bighorns. But if there was some kind of certificate, it's like, hey, these, you know, I'm a conservation-minded sheep owner, and I've done my part, and it's verified. Then I buy my wool from them. But you know, there's a lot of kind of aspects of this. So if we're supporting wool growers who have their sheep, domestic sheep, up where bighorns are, we're kind of supporting the problem when we're buying that wool, right?
Okay, I agree with you. And I do think that wildlife held in the public trusts, their interests and welfare should always prevail on public lands. And I appreciate your responses. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, next question is from Linda. Linda, please ask your question.
Hello, I have two. The first one is, I'm assuming that before, you know, white man came and there were more bighorns and lions, that they balanced out. And the reason they're not now is primarily due to the disease, but correct me if that assumption is wrong. So I guess my question is, why aren't they balancing anymore? What else have we done to the planet so that they can't just naturally coexist? And the second question is, because mountain lions are a crucial keystone species, when we take them out of an area in these management plans for the sheep or for whatever reason, what is the main other negative consequence of that removal?
Thanks, Linda. Well, you're completely right on with your first assumption. So basically with these, you know, I think when I started getting into this problem, so number one with bighorns is, I mean, the disease issue is kind of the all-encompassing issue. But then you've got all these other things going on where you've got, a lot of these are really small herds, you know, so like where I live, in Northwest Wyoming, the Absarokas have 4,000 bighorn sheep in a meta population. And it's the only intact herd in the whole United States. It's never been sheep brought into or sheep brought out of. There were a lot of domestic sheep in that range. And that meta population does have Movi in it, but they're able, because they're so big, they have genetic, they can connectivity, they have genetic connectivity, so they can rebound from impact. There's lion hunting, but they're not doing lion, you know, predation plans. They're not looking to cull mountain lions for bighorn sheep there. So there's just sort of a natural system going on there. Whereas in these other places where you have these very small herds and you don't have any connectivity, so if you have an episode go through, you can just have like massive die-off all of a sudden. They had an example of that was like in Montana, there was a herd in the Tendoys, and they just couldn't recover. It was a small herd, they just couldn't recover from Movi, and there was about 30 animals left. And so the only thing they could think of to do as Montana Game and Fish was to basically kill off that herd and start anew with a new reintroduction. So yeah, bighorn sheep have a lot of issues. And then you put into that climate change and maybe competition in terms of all the kind of livestock that are on the range in general. So there's just, you know, it's a complex issue with them that's not easy, and Movi and disease is the main thing that really keeps them suppressed. So I think I would totally agree with you that, you know, we've screwed things up here, and in the past, there would be large herds that had large metapopulations. And so if some of these were picked off naturally by lions, it wasn't an issue.
Thank you very much. The other question was, when the lions are removed, since they're a keystone species, even if it helps the sheep, which, let me just be clear, I'm a fan of both the sheep and the lions, then what's the biggest consequence to the environment or the animal populations of other species when the keystone species is removed?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, and mostly we're talking about like Southwest, these areas like New Mexico and Arizona. And there's a new book that's by Mark Elbrock. I might encourage you to read. And there's an essay, a part in there on bighorn sheep in the Southwest and what's gone on. And he makes an interesting argument. I mean, his argument is, again, like in the Southwest, hey, there probably weren't very many mountain lions. There's not really good habitat for them. Mountain lions really need cover. And bighorn sheep, there used to be fires there, and they need a viewscape in order to stay away from predators. And his argument was, hey, if you're really going to do this, don't kill off the mountain lions, get rid of the mule deer, because there didn't used to be mule deer there, and that's what brings in all these mountain lions. Probably that's never going to happen because that's like a hunting favorite, but it's just kind of an interesting way to think about it. And I can't really tell you what, the impact is totally in the Southwest when they remove, mountain lions from these. I just don't think they should be, but it's a complicated issue.
I'll get the book. Thank you. I live in Arizona and I've ordered both of your books. So thank you very much for today.
Okay. Our next question is from EJ. EJ, please ask your question.
Yeah, I was curious about the phrase you used at the beginning of the talk, the market hunt. Is that like a trophy hunt? I just hadn't heard the term before.
Yeah, and if you read up on what happened in the 1800s, that's the term they always use, is market hunting. And I think so there was no regulation, so it wasn't trophy hunting. So of course there were people just coming in like settlers, and they were just, we need food. Hey, let's kill off what's around us, right? But also the railroads were coming in, so they were feeding all those workers and miners. And also market hunting would refer to like killing these animals for their hides and selling their hides. So selling it on the market is really, you think of it that way.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate your presentation today.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with a question while we give our audience some time to think about things. Leslie, will you talk to me a little bit about connective corridors? I'd love to know what can be done to preserve metapopulations and good genetics for bighorns that would ensure their stability and would lessen lion culling.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So let's see where to start with that. So there is some thoughts about going on with, and I like it around the Tucson area, there's some people working on basically having connective corridors, like putting connections over freeways, like you've seen probably, where overpasses or underpasses for animals, connecting. So these animals can go from one range to, these are small ranges, so they can go from one range to another range. And there is in Nevada going on, and they have, so far in Arizona, last I looked, in the Tucson area, they've had a lot of animals go on these overpasses or underpasses, but they haven't had any bighorn sheep yet. But in in Nevada, they have on some of these overpasses, they have bighorn sheep going through. So that's, building these overpasses is one thing. I guess for me, my main thing is just having looking at habitat, looking at where there's good ranges, good habitat, and just having large areas where you can protect these areas, have no livestock, no sheep, no goats, no, cows in these areas. I would not even have hunting in these areas at all. And just basically let these animals kind of have these large areas where they can have have connected corridors on their own. Of course, you have to have good habitat, and we might have to do restoration work in that habitat. But I think the main thing is having these small isolated, groups where you keep, dumping in new bighorn sheep for genetics. It's not sustainable. And then when you think about climate change, we don't even know what's that going to do in the mix. And the other thing that really kind of struck me was this whole thing about water catchments in the Southwest. I just didn't even know what to think about that, where Arizona is like delivering, I think last year they delivered over a million gallons of water to these water catchments. Well, is that going to be sustainable into the future? I mean, next year they're going to have to start doing their own management, because they're not going to get as much water from the Colorado River, and as climate change happens. So I think there's a lot to think about in here in terms of bighorn sheep, protecting bighorn sheep and protecting wildlife. And I think giving them as much habitat as we can for themselves. Not that we can't go in there, but we'd have to restrict what happens in there. Is to me the only thing I can see for the future to preserve these animals.
Certainly something that we agree with you on at Mountain Lion Foundation, and certainly something that we have put a lot of effort into as well. So I know we're running short on time, but I would love to ask another question. Let me be as selective as I can, because there were some really good ones I wanted to ask you. Let's see, what can the public do relative to state line management programs for bighorn herds? What can the public do?
Well, I think the best thing the public can do, and I say this for everything, whether it be bighorn sheep, whether it be, wolves or bears or mountain lions, is get involved with your state game management. So that means literally going to your game and fish commission meetings. I mean, because who goes to those commission meetings? Hunters go to those commission meetings. And so that's, the voice that they constantly hear. The other thing about, and they're the ones who make these decisions. So the other thing about game and fish commission meetings, game and fish in general, and these state agencies in general, is that they're supported by hunting licenses and of course, Pittman Robertson, which is gun sales. So where are people who are conservationists? We're not in the mix. Right now, we don't really get our voices heard. So being as proactive as you can about that. I mean, if it was left up to me, if I was president, I'd just say, hey, we should start contributing. Gun sales contribute. Hey, we should contribute for, photographic equipment or backpacking equipment, and then get a seat at the table. So the more we show up, the more we get to have a seat, a potential seat at the table. So that's my first thing is we need to have a seat at the table, us people who are non-hunters or conservationists who, care about wildlife beyond hunting. And my feeling is that right now what's happening with bighorn sheep is that who's paying for all this? This is a lot of money, and there's not many hunting licenses for this. I mean, deer, elk, there's a lot of deer and elk. The hunting licenses basically pay for that. But bighorn sheep, there's not very many of them. So I have down here, for instance, 1/4 of all state game agency revenues comes from bighorn hunting licenses that are sold to the public. But the other 3/4 comes from governor auctions and raffles. So for instance, this guy named Rick Smith who is some computer guy from Texas who's rich. So he was the highest bidder in this New Mexico auction. He spent over $1 million. Over 8 years, he won 7 bighorn tags. 90% of that $1 million goes to New Mexico Game and Fish. So what does that mean? If hunters are the ones, and basically we're talking about rich hunters, we're not talking about your guy next door, because your guy next door can be putting in every year for his whole life for a sheep tag. Now, a deer tag, he'll get that year. A sheep tag, he may never get in his lifetime. But that rich guy, he got it. So what's happening is that bighorn sheep are being put as many mountains as they can be put on, because to support hunters, and hunters are paying for this, especially rich hunters. And to me, bighorn sheep, as well as all of our other wildlife, belong in the public trust. So somehow there has to be some kind of monetary way that we can all support this effort. And so then we all get our voices heard in this.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Leslie. This has been not only really enjoyable because I've learned so much, but it's eye-opening. Certainly learning a lot from you. And we hope that the people who are watching today do take your advice and do become more involved. And we have a lot of work to do to balance this all out. So I want to ask anyone if they have any more questions as we're coming to an end of our time. Anybody who has any last minute questions to get in there? I don't think so. So
We have one question. that
Great.
popped up.
I will go ahead and turn it over then.
Okay, so Pamela, please ask your question.
So I'm always troubled by that argument that only ammunition and guns and auctions support conservation, because I think that everybody who pays taxes in this country pays to support our federal public lands. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, Idaho is more than 62% public land. So, and I will tell you that the Idaho Fish and Game Commission could not possibly care less what an advocate says, and neither can anybody in the department. But it really galls me that that I feel like I'm paying for a lot of these activities to take place on public lands, and yet I have no voice in what happens.
I agree with you completely, Pamela. I mean, I agree with you completely. And like a lot of times, like it's just a couple of us who show up at these Game and Fish Commission meetings. And then like, for instance, like on wolves, they might get, thousands of input from out of state, and they throw them away. They just consider in state, but they already have it figured out what the wolf hunt is going to be that year. So it doesn't really hardly matter what I say, but it would matter if I do feel if I somehow could get a seat at the table, if it wasn't just like hunting licenses that we're paying for all this. And you're right, we're all paying for these public lands. These are our public lands. And again, wildlife are in the public trust. So really it's the responsibility of all of us. It's just kind of been delegated to these it's really old school, and things are going to change because there's only 5% of the population are hunters. And a lot of us like to wildlife watch and take photos, but it's going to change, but it's pretty slow.
Sure is. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, I think that might have been our last question. Thank you, Leslie, for a really engaged presentation. It certainly taught everyone quite a bit, and I think everybody was really excited to be able to participate. So we thank you for being here today, and we thank you for your incredibly important work. And we hope that we have you back on again here soon. And I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for participating. And that is it for this educational webinar today. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. Thanks, Mountain Lion Foundation.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everybody.